And I would like now to call the next speaker. We are very honored to host a talk by Robert Zatorre, who is probably the world's specialist of the impact of music on the brain and how music is processed by the brain. Robert Zatorre is the professor and chair of research in Canada at the Montreal Neurological Institute, the famous MNI at McGill University. And he has been working on music for all of his career, I believe. He is the author of a very recent book, which is really, I think, the most recent, most encompassing, beautiful synthesis of the field. It's called From Perception to Pleasure, the Neuroscience of Music. And it's in English. I hear that there's a Spanish translation, and I hope there will be a French translation. So Robert Zatorre, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Stan, pour cette introduction. Merci à tout le monde d'être ici et notamment merci à la Fondation Vareille et le Collège de France de m'avoir invité. Toujours un plaisir d'être de retour à Paris. Vous avez vu peut-être sur mon écran qu'il est 4 heures le matin pour moi. Alors, essayer de donner une conférence en français à 4 heures, c'est un peu challenging. So I'm going to switch to English, but vous pouvez toujours me poser des questions en français pendant la séance après la présentation. So this was the original title that I had given Madame Delphine, who very kindly helped put together this program. But I decided it's kind of long and boring. So this is actually a better title, which I think reflects a little bit more the interest of this symposium. And so really what I'm trying to do is to try to understand a little bit more in detail the underlying neural mechanism that may be behind, or one of the neural mechanisms that could be behind the types of phenomena that we're all interested in. So, of course, we're all interested in the potential cognitive consequences of musical training, and we just heard from Asal very nice ways of looking at that, and very good empirical support, in fact, from her work and from many other labs. But we know there's also some controversy surrounding it. And so my job, I think, because I am really coming from the neuroscience perspective, not so much from the educational perspective or even from psychology perspective. So my job is really to try to provide a better neurobiological framework to understand what might be behind these effects. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the auditory motor dorsal pathway as a candidate substrate that might support some of these sorts of experience-dependent plasticity phenomena. So I think Emmanuel showed this picture earlier. This depicts some of the pathways that interconnect the auditory regions, which are found here in the temporal lobe, with other parts of the brain. And some of you will be familiar with the dorsal and ventral pathways from work in the visual domain, which has a very long and distinguished history. And today I'm going to focus primarily on the more dorsal pathway, which is responsible for a very large number of different cognitive processes. I have listed some of them here. We have sensory motor integration, which is a particularly important one, also mental rotation, aspects of speech, work from Stan Dehaene's group, which has also shown the importance of these pathways for arithmetic processing, for reading, and so on and so forth. Working memory as well, very important. So that's what we know from vision, which I would say is kind of further ahead than research on audition. But we do know that the auditory dorsal stream, which encompasses these pathways starting in posterior auditory areas and connecting up to the parietal cortex and premotor regions and other prefrontal regions, We do know that this system is responsible for a number of similar kinds of computations than as have been described in vision. What we're really interested in is how these pathways may be enhanced by different kinds of environmental inputs. We're all particularly interested in musical training, of course, but there are other ways to demonstrate plasticity in the system, and I'll talk about some brain stimulation studies that we've done along those lines. And we're going to start by focusing on sensory-motor integration. And what do I mean by that? I mean that in order to execute any kind of action that generates sound, and that includes speech, but also, of course, music, you need to integrate the auditory system with the motoric system. They both have to be coupled and function very efficiently together. And so to demonstrate that, I have this little video. We heard some beautiful music from Emmanuel and his group earlier, beautiful string music. Here, what I'm going to show you is sort of related because this is a motion capture video provided by my colleague Marcella Wanderley at McGill. And what you're going to see is the movement of the bow. This is the bow of the violin. You're looking at it from the front. Here, you're looking at it from the top. And we also have the force of the bow and the inclination of the bow. And when the musician plays, you're going to see the trajectories that are generated by the movement of the bow as they are playing. Now, when we try this thank you. Sorry, I'm going to start again because we don't want to start the partita in the middle. That's not good. Look at the movements here. You see how precise they are? They overlap perfectly. Look at beautiful figure 8. Sometimes I think we should just forget about the lecture and listen to the whole partita, and that would be a nice thing to do. But what this illustrates to me is the remarkable precision that the musician has. These, like that figure 8 that you saw there, no one teaches, I don't think, maybe some violin teachers will correct me, I don't think anyone says to the violinist, you have to make a figure 8 in space, right? It's a consequence of the movement trajectory, which is required to produce the sound. So what this means is that the auditory and the motor systems are absolutely beautifully coupled to be able to generate these incredible movements. Now, how do we understand what's going on here? Well, we know that it's the interactions between the motor system here and the auditory system that are responsible. We do understand a little bit about these pathways, which I'll show you in greater detail here. And as you can see, it is primarily this sort of dorsal stream that's involved, where the motor system is sending commands to the muscles, but is also sending some kind of information to the auditory system, giving it some kind of a predictive cue about the sound to expect. At the same time, the auditory system is sending information to the motor system regarding the intended consequence of the action. And so these two systems are perfectly coupled together. Now, we wanted to study this sort of phenomenon of playing a musical instrument inside an MRI scanner. And, you know, if you try to put a violin in the scanner, it just doesn't fit. You know, the violin is coming out here, the scanner is small. So instead, what we did was we created an MRI-compatible cello. And I believe we still have the only such device in the world. This is one of my former students, Melanie Sagado, who is a cellist and also did her PhD in my lab. And so this device is weird looking, but it can actually be played. And here it is inside the scanner. We have a tiny bow. We went to a luthier and we asked him to make a bow that's about 15 centimeters long, which is a weird thing, but it fits inside the scanner. And when we have musicians playing, we see indeed the activity in this exact system that we had described actually in the 2007 paper, and we see it beautifully demonstrated here. So auditory regions, the interparietal region, and some of the premotor and prefrontal areas. Okay, now that we have this instrument and we see the actual network that's involved, we can try to understand some aspects of its plasticity. And to do that, we're going to do some longitudinal studies, but we're not nearly as heroic as Asal is. We are only doing these studies over the course of a few weeks with healthy adults who do not have any particular musical training. And this is work that was done by my former postdoc, Indiana Woolman, who is now back home here in Paris. I don't know if she's here. Tu es là, Indiana? But she's working with the Philharmonie de Paris with the Projet Demos, which is very related to what we're discussing today. So we actually train people to play our cello device inside the scanner, and we scan them at different times. And first of all, just looking at the learning trajectories, I said they did not have musical training, but within a matter of a few weeks, their performance improves. So their pitch errors decrease and their timing errors decrease. And this is the performance inside the scanner. So we know they're learning something. And what we're interested in is, well, what's changing in the brain when they learn? And what changes, indeed, is this dorsal system. So here's a view of the top part of the brain. And what I'm showing you here is the difference between the performance at week 4 and at the very beginning. I should say the activity during listening at week 4 compared to the beginning. And what you see is a recruitment of all these regions. So the dorsal premotor cortex, which is here, the supplementary motor area, and the superior parietal region. And not only that, but these regions are actually the same ones that are active during playing. So they're active during listening here, but they're overlapping with the regions that are active during playing. And we see that there's an enhanced connectivity between the two systems. So the parietal cortex, supplementary motor area are functionally interrelating to a greater extent after training than before. So this is a good example, I think, of experience-induced plasticity, and over a very short time frame. So you can only imagine that with years of training, this sort of phenomenon becomes even greater, even more important. We did a similar study a few years back with Sibylle Herhotz and Emily Coffey, and here it was a piano study rather than the cello, but we found sort of similar things. And the interesting part of this experiment is that we had people listen to melodies. Here's a simple melody that they were listening to. And we also had them imagine the melody. I won't go into the details of the task, but there were two sets of trials, actual listening and then the imagination part. And what we did was we scanned people, again, before and after they did the training. So there was a baseline period during which nothing happened, and then we look at the brain activity while listening to these tunes before and after they learn to play the tunes. And once again, we get exactly the same sorts of regions, dorsal premotor and parietal, in this case cerebellum as well. And what's cool here is that we even see it during the imagination. So the blue images correspond to the imagery trials, and the red ones correspond to listen. And you can see they're very similar. So this motor system is invoked when listening to the music that you know how to play, but not to the music that you don't know how to play. And it's even invoked when you're just imagining the music. So there's no actual sound going into your ear, but you're generating an internal representation of that music. So this shows how tight this coupling really is, that the motor system is even active when you're just imagining. Now, we're interested in this idea of transfer, of enhancement of other cognitive functions besides the ones that are trained. And one example of this that Nina Krause has done a lot of work on, and we'll hear from her shortly, is the perception of sounds embedded in noise. And here's one example from a study that we did with my former postdoc, Yi Du. And what we looked at here was the performance of hearing speech sounds in noise as a function of different amounts of noise. So this is very much, very noisy here, a signal-to-noise ratio of minus 12 decibels. And this is no noise, so silent condition. And you see that musicians really outperformed the non-musicians pretty much across the board. And when we scan them, we see that there's more activity, especially in these dorsal areas amongst the musicians compared to the non-musicians. It's also present in the non-musicians, but it's greater. And what we see is that, in fact, again, the connectivity, looking at the relationship between the activity in auditory regions and these more dorsal regions is greater in the musicians, who are shown in pink here, compared to the non-musicians. So once again, we see that in this case, long-term training in the sense of music enhances performance on this task, and it seems to enhance it via recruitment of this dorsal stream and interactions between the dorsal stream and the auditory regions. This enhancement, by the way, was correlated with improved performance. So this is why we think this dorsal stream is particularly relevant. Okay, now I'm going to switch to a different function, but related one, of the dorsal stream, which is the manipulation of information in working memory. So what do I mean by manipulation? Well, we can contrast it against retention. So we came up with a series of musical tasks that require either simple retention. For example, here you have a simple melody, and then it's either repeated or it's repeated with one note change. This is a very typical kind of task, not very hard to do. Sounds like this. Let's try that again. You can use your musical imagination, I think, and you'll get that. But then we did two other tricks. We presented the melody, but this time in a different key. So you can see here it's just a transposition into another key from C to G. And again, there was either an altered note or not. So this is a more difficult task because it requires you to process the relationships between the tones rather than the absolute pitch of each of the tones. And then we did a harder task, which is a mental reversal. So you hear this pattern, and then you hear the pattern reversed, and you have to say if it's the same pattern when it's reversed or not. Let me see if I can play this one. This thing is devilishly hard. Thank you. Thank you, Stan. So what happens when we do this? What we find is a very consistent recruitment of these dorsal regions for both kinds of what I'm calling manipulations. So we're looking at the transposed versus the control, or the reversed versus the control. And in both cases, what we see here is the parietal regions here and the supplementary motor area. And similarly for the transposed ones, we see especially here the parietal cortex. These were two separate experiments that we did first with one type of manipulation, then with the other. And then we thought, well, we should really put them both together. So we did a third experiment, also because everyone complains about replication these days. And so in the third experiment, we had the same participants using the same melodies with reversing or transposition, and then we superimposed them in this conjunction analysis. And what you can see is that indeed the parietal regions and supplementary motor regions are systematically engaged. It's also some premotor cortex. So despite the difference between these two types of tasks, they both involve the manipulation of information in auditory working memory, and they both recruit the same dorsal system. This dorsal system is highly sensitive to training. So when we look at a large population of people with different amounts of musical practice over their lifetime, we see that performance both on the transposition and on the simple task, as well as on a rhythm task that I didn't tell you about, definitely goes up with training. This doesn't happen for a speech task, because you don't have to be a musician to be good at speech, right? You might be good in terms of speech and noise, but not just in terms of distinguishing speech sounds. We also see that it's correlated with brain structure, and this is actually rather consistent with what Asal showed us before. So we see correlations here, both with gray matter density and with cortical thickness, in terms of how performance is related to thickness in this region, and we see it in the dorsal stream as well, both on the left hemisphere and on the right. So auditory and dorsal regions are all interrelated in terms of performance. Similarly, one can see a relationship to musical training in white matter structure. This is from a paper by some Chinese authors, and they looked at the fiber bundles that interconnect the temporal lobe with dorsal regions, and what you see is that the structure is enhanced as a function of practice time. We found a similar effect in our lab, some work done with Virginia Penhune, where looking again at the white matter that interconnects dorsal regions, what we see is an enhancement in the connectivity. This is actually the anatomical connectivity as opposed to the functional. But what we see here is that the enhancement is primarily in the people who have received musical training early. So with earlier age of onset, the earlier you begin your training, the greater the anatomical change that you observe. And this is, I think, very important for the points that were raised earlier with regards to early childhood education. You still get some advantage in later years, but it sort of tapers off. So it's not that there is no plasticity in adulthood, there is, and I've shown you the evidence. However, the plasticity is obviously greater earlier, and so it makes sense to have that training early. Still talking about auditory working memory, in some work that I've done with Philippe Albouy, who trained here in France, in Lyon. We use the same task, but this time sort of simplified. Instead of having 5 tones, we just have 3 tones, but it's the same reversal task that I showed you before. You just have to indicate if the tone patterns are the same or different when they are reversed compared to the control condition. We know from the previous study that I showed you which regions are active in the dorsal stream, but what Philippe wanted to do was to see if we can identify a kind of a functional biomarker of the activity of this system. And so we used magnetoencephalography to look at performance on this reversal task as a function of the oscillations that are measured in the brain. And what's nice here is that you've got this task where you hear the target sound, then you have 2 seconds during which nothing happens, and then you hear the comparison sound. But indeed, during this time that supposedly nothing's happening, your brain is actually very hard at work, and it's generating a lot of activity in this 5 hertz frequency range, which is known as the theta band. So you see this big red blob here. That's when you are actually actively manipulating the stimulus, even though there's no physical sound there. You're using your working memory to try to generate this reversed sound. And indeed, the degree to which that activity is happening here, the power in this 5 hertz theta band, is correlated with the performance of each individual. Each of these dots is a separate individual. So people who perform particularly well are the ones who have particularly high value in this frequency range. And so that's sort of important because it gives us more insight into the characteristics of this pathway that we're so interested in. Now, you might say, well, this is a correlation, and how do we know that it's really causally related? Well, we can investigate that using brain stimulation. So here we're using transcranial magnetic stimulation. And the nice thing about TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, is that you can adjust the frequency of the pulses. So we can generate pulses at 5 times in 1 second, so that's 5 hertz, theta, or we can generate 5 pulses in 1 second, but completely randomly in terms of time. So there's no consistent frequency here. And so this is the control condition. And when we do that, we see that, in fact, we can enhance performance with stimulation in this theta band. But the enhancement is very specific to this type of stimulation. It does not occur in the control condition, and it's specific to the manipulation and not to the simple retention. And once again, the degree to which the enhancement occurs, so the size of this effect here in the green bar, is correlated with the degree of change that you get from the stimulation. So in other words, the more your brain responds to the stimulation, the better the performance is. And so we think this is quite useful in terms of understanding the underlying mechanism. We see that boosting brain activity in this particular range, in this particular location, in this network, enhances this particular task. And so this means that this theta band is possibly a biomarker that we might want to investigate in future studies, for example, of musical training. So I'm just going to skip over a couple of things here and tell you one last thing, which is more directly linked to training. So if we just look at this task, same task we've been using, we see that it is indeed very sensitive to musical training. This is number of hours, and you see a very clear correlation with performance on this task. But we're also interested in how this relates to other tasks. And so similarly to the speech and noise tasks that I talked about earlier and that Nina, I think, will possibly talk about later, we have developed what we call a music and noise task. So you hear a melody which is embedded in a background of noise, and then you hear either the same melody or a different one, and you have to say same or different. This is a simple task, except that hearing this is difficult because it's in noise. And this task also is very sensitive to amount of practice, as you can see. But interestingly, when we do a mediation analysis, this is a statistical procedure that allows us to indicate whether the performance on this music and noise task is directly linked to the musical training, or is it indirectly linked to musical training via working memory. And so this mediation analysis actually demonstrates that the variance associated with performance on this task in relation to musical training is completely accounted for by enhancement of auditory working memory. In other words, when you obtain musical training, it enhances your auditory working memory, because of course you're doing that all the time when you're a musician. You're exercising your musical auditory working memory. And so that function seems to be what is actually behind the enhancements in these hearing and noise situations. And we know that this system is part of the dorsal stream, and I've shown you earlier evidence that it also is important for hearing and noise. So it sort of makes sense that this is the underlying mechanism. So I'm just going to remind you of the main points. The take-home message is that the auditory dorsal stream is perhaps one putative neurobiological substrate that's influenced by musical training. It's one among many, I suspect. It's the one I decided to focus on today. I've shown you evidence that it does demonstrate experience-dependent plasticity, even in short term. There's also anatomical differences that you see in the long term. And we think that it has a characteristic neural signature in this theta band. Plus, I've shown you evidence that interactions between auditory and dorsal systems are important for these relatively close transfer effects of musical training on hearing and noise. And so I will just stop there and be sure to thank all of my collaborators who did all the work and all the different agencies and people who have given us the money to do that work. And I thank you very much for your attention.